Cool. Yes.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining. Did you enjoy the intro track? As always, I have to say thank you to Hikosaemon, who makes that available free on SoundCloud. Thank you so much.
Yes, yes. That's something I do on the side. But yes, if you want to, if you're looking for music for your videos or whatever, I put it out royalty free. So and in a Creative Commons license, so anyone can use it for stuff like this. And yeah, thank you for using
It's great. I love it. I love your tracks. You're very talented.
it.
Do you
Please
have any
continue.
time? Do you have any time to do that with
No, not
your?
lately.
No.
I actually, I wish I had more time, but yeah, it's something when I have the time to do, I enjoy doing.
Well, shall we start with the
Yeah.
news? So we're talking about the news in Japan and how it relates to the balance of what's good for people, what's good for the planet, and of course the economy, how to make a profit. Today, I was really happy to see Baye McNeil did a great article about Martin Luther King Jr. Day, which of
Hmm.
course is in the States, mostly. Of course, he was from America. But Baye writes at the Japan Times, and he talks a lot about, kind of a positive look forward, how he has seen some progress and how he often refers to black creatives or people in Japan and how there are big problems, but things are kind of moving in the right direction. So that was nice to see today.
Yeah, yeah. It's funny, Baye. Uh, I love the guy. I love his writing, and I've met him a few times, and he's an excellent person. I worry, is he mellowing with age? I hope. I think there is progress. It's always good to see progress, and it's great to see him seeing and feeling like there's progress. And he's actually moved the needle on a bunch of stuff.
Oh,
Some of the stuff which he's called
he's
out.
been very
Uh,
active. Yeah.
I mean, credit to NHK that they brought him in to go and give them sensitivity training and
Yeah,
diversity training when he called out the blackface thing and some other things on
definitely.
reporting there on that children's news show when he went and gave them coaching on that. And yeah, yeah, it's kind of I think he's actually contributing to that. But at the same time, I remember 10 years ago when he was constantly outraged, and it's kind of funny how he's become a sort of a gentler kind of kind of. I don't think he's going soft. I think it's actually. I think it is. Maybe it's a combination. He's getting a bit soft, but I think
He
there's
can
also
definitely
genuine progress.
take some of the credit, I think, for the good
He
things that
can.
are happening. But
He
yeah,
can. It's really
it's a
impressive.
constant in terms of diversity and inclusion. It's a constant thing. It's not something you can do and it's over. Next Wednesday, I'm talking to Ayana Wise as well in the series, so that'll be an interesting discussion. She was very active with Black Lives Matter in Japan and does a great talk show, so that'll be a great discussion.
Wow.
Do you want to talk about one of your topics first?
Sure. Well, I mean,
Well, we
first of all, from me, I know you've been non-stop. I've been watching some of your podcasts as we've talked about just before this. But happy 2021,
yes,
and this is the first
me
the
too.
sustainability for 2021. It is interesting looking
Yeah.
forward and looking back. Um, so yeah, the first story that I picked out a few, which I flipped you right before the show, which was completely unreasonable.
No, no,
But I'll
no
tell you
worries.
what, I will pick as a first one. I had like four that I thought were good or not good. uh, Maybe some negative news first. 2020. I don't like people who say worst year ever and stuff like that. I mean, every year's got its stuff, but certainly 2020 did come out globally as the tying 2016 as the warmest year ever. Um,
Yeah,
I think I'm
that was a
really
shock.
encouraged to see the renewed momentum that I feel like happened in 2020 towards paying attention to climate change and motivation to do something about it and not using other people's inaction as an excuse. However, in spite of the positives that we've been talking about on this, of the sort of direction back towards trying to reduce emissions, the work that lies ahead, this is a good reminder. It's not just a matter of, it's a bit like the coronavirus. It's not just a matter of having one state of emergency and everybody trying hard for a short push. This is a marathon. And I think all the simulations say that no matter how good things are, no matter how hard we try, it's going to keep going up for a while,
Yeah.
just because of the carbon dioxide and other gases that have already been added. So yeah, I'm just looking at Ars Technica, um, and
I've
yeah,
got it up on screen now. Yeah. It's
yeah,
crazy, and I think at the beginning of 2020, because all the flights had really cut down, people weren't traveling as much. There were a lot of decreases in carbon in terms of transportation, and people felt kind of hopeful that maybe we'll give the environment a break.
yeah,
But we
yeah.
realized that we've done so much damage up until then that we really do need to make significant changes if we're gonna, you know, have a chance of survival or future generations that have a planet
Yeah.
to live on.
And certainly the parts per million of carbon dioxide that I think they measure at the top of Mauna Kea in Hawaii, somewhere that they've got this place where they can measure sort of the relatively least sort of direct from a factory. It's got to go across the Pacific there, but yeah, the concentrations have like multiplied. It is kind of crazy that we are breathing very different air now to 100 years ago.
Yeah.
And yeah, it is interesting to hear about how, for example, and to see how in places like China, they've actually had some blue skies. The actual short-term industrial emissions and so on associated with output has obviously improved, and some people have enjoyed better air quality, maybe even water quality, and so on, with industrial output going down. In terms of like reversing the damage that we've done, this is just another reminder. And apparently, the thing that was alarming about 2020, looking at the article, was pointing out that this was a year that, due to other regular weather cycles, it should have been a cooler than normal year, and yet it matched. So, we're starting 2021 with a pretty high baseline. Not to mention, I mean, part of the reason that the state of emergency for COVID kind of is failing at the moment here in Tokyo is we had such lovely weather on Saturday, which on the one hand was lovely. It was like a spring. It was like 19 degrees Celsius. It was like a spring day, but it really shouldn't be that temperature in January. And remembering how miserable summer is in Japan, knowing that this is as cold as it gets and how extreme things swing. Yeah, there's a long road ahead on this, and it certainly is worth remembering. There's reason to be optimistic, but at the same time, yeah, it's going to be a tough thing to turn around.
Yeah. And in terms of coronavirus, you mentioned the cases going up. I've got on screen right now. Tokyo
Mm,
reports 1,592 new coronavirus cases.
mm.
This is worse than last year's rates at all.
Infinitely.
Is this due
Yeah.
to more testing? That's what people might argue, but there seems to be a real lack of testing as well in Japan. Hiroshima came out in the news last week because they've announced that they're going to try to test asymptomatic people.
Mm.
They're going to try to test 800,000 people in
Oh
Hiroshima
wow,
City.
I hadn't
Yeah,
heard that.
that
That's very ambitious.
at the moment there's 0.43 tests per thousand people in Japan,
Mm.
and
Yeah.
so Hiroshima's government is talking about doing a big push, doing 800,000 free tests, and seeing if they can get a bearing on actual numbers or closer to
Oh,
actual numbers. Yeah, so that'll be interesting to see if that goes forward.
it's a massive exercise. Yeah. Yeah, and it's different to the way that Japan's been doing it. In terms of testing has improved dramatically from the start. I mean, there just wasn't the capacity even to do the testing in the beginning. And so the Japanese government, kind of working with a lack of capacity and infrastructure to do testing, took an approach. So, okay, we're not going to test everybody. We're only going to test people who appear to be symptomatic. And there seems to be a very good reason. And even people who are symptomatic, they weren't testing in the beginning. Um, and then they figured out, I think in about May, that given the lack of testing and people accusing, oh, you're probably missing a bunch of people, they started taking that positive rate um, percentage as an indication of whether you're testing enough or not enough, or whether you're with the likelihood that there's probably like 20 people for every person that you're catching with this, but getting an idea if the testing isn't enough. And I think I remember they set the line, if the number of per test done, if the rate is like 5%, or less, that's an indication that you're probably doing a good job of catching generally the number of people who have it. But if the number in Tokyo lately has been 8%, 9%, I think it got over 10%, which implies that as well as the numbers are skyrocketing, the tests are catching a smaller proportion of those people than they were catching back before. It is amazing how quickly you become desensitized to numbers. Everyone was panicking at 100 cases last April,
Yeah,
and everyone,
no
I
kidding.
was wondering if I should even go to the convenience store. Uh, and now we have, some days more than 2,000 people per day now in Tokyo, and clearly the streets are more crowded. I'm not going to work or anything, but I'm not hesitating to go to the supermarket or, even me, I'm definitely feeling numbed. And I saw the number today, 1,500 today. And it's amazing how I've gone from panicking at 100 to seeing 1,500 and thinking, oh, that's not so bad.
And
But it's
there's
terrible, isn't it?
definitely a dull effect, right? Over time, you
I mean,
panic at first, and then you get used to it, and
yeah,
then you have this false sense of security that if I haven't gotten it now, I'm not going to get it, and I'll be fine. And they've actually reported that a lot more people are going out than the last state of emergency, right? Like
right,
people
right.
aren't taking it as seriously.
Nobody's reacting like before. And you know what? This is actually to tie things to other topics. It's not unlike what's clearly happened with things like climate change. When you had HFCs and stuff like that, when you had problems that you could solve in a short number of years and get a result, and everyone felt great, that was doable. But when you got a problem that you have to tackle for a really long time, yeah, it's just mentally hard for us to stay focused for that long. And clearly, even this, literally life or death, short term, measurable, you can see the hospitals falling apart, and it's hard, isn't it?
Yeah,
Um, yeah, it's a real
that is
interesting
so
lesson on
true.
society.
Yeah.
For
And
Hiroshima, how are they doing the tests? Oh, sorry.
no, no, that's fine. They haven't given details about how they're going to do the tests quite yet.
Hmm.
But that comparison, the 0.43 tests per thousand people, if you
Yeah.
compare to the UK, it's 8.4 per thousand people. If you compare to the US, 3.9 per thousand people. So it is really under testing the each area in Japan. Um,
Hmm.
and Hiroshima, this is interesting comparison to Tokyo about the
Yeah.
penalties. In your show last night, you were talking about the penalties, the stick for
Or
if you
lack thereof.
disobey the state of emergency, right? But
Yeah.
Hiroshima is actually offering a carrot, right? They're saying we'll
Yeah.
give you, as a bar restaurant, give you 60,000 yen a day if you comply and close by 8 o'clock, or close when we're trying to do a
Hmm.
state of emergency. So I also thought that was interesting. So Hiroshima seems to have a different tactic for trying to handle this virus. We're going to test more, and we're going to give incentives to businesses that follow the guidelines. So that was interesting.
They, I think what they were doing in Tokyo was they were just handing out anybody could put a rainbow mark in their restaurant if they promised that they were taking measures, but no one was checking it. They were giving compensation to small restaurants for the
Okay.
curfews for the shortened
Mm-hmm.
hours. Last time they gave it to all restaurants, whereas this time, probably partly because they've spent a lot of money already, they're only giving it to small restaurants. I don't think it's in exchange for proving that they're doing something good or closing, but that's triggered a backlash from large restaurants which say, hey, we're in the same sort of amount of trouble. So, yeah, that's a real problematic thing right now. Across the country, they have definitely used stimulus, economic stimuli, stuff like that. In Japan, there's a big debate at the moment. The government's debating introducing the concept of penalties for not complying with lockdowns or quarantines, which doesn't exist in Japan right now. And there's actually a debate in Japan as to whether it's even constitutional to be able to, in effect, it is a kind of imprisonment, right? And the idea of whether the government has the power to imprison people by saying stay indoors, which the rest of the world has gone long past that. In New Zealand and Australia, you see these fines and police detaining people and so on. And it's very different to Korea and Taiwan. It's something that's unique about Japan, that for all the perceptions about what Japan is, it is actually still, since World War II anyway, maybe because they had such an extreme government at that time, the backlash against that, the idea of ever having the government having powers to detain people for not complying with a declared pandemic, yeah, it's actually, Japan is very liberal in the sense of, freedom oriented, and it's actually a huge step that people are debating whether you can even have penalties for this. Although most of the public seems to support it, but it's funny. It's amazing, and yes, while there have been more tests in the UK, and far fewer in Japan, it is interesting. It's counterintuitive, but how Japan has somehow fared, it seems better, at least in terms of the number of people ending up in hospital and dying. You could say that Japan's not catching as many cases, but they're not hiding the deaths. So,
and the hospitals are overrun right now.
They are now hitting capacity.
Right? Yeah. That was another of your articles last night. You talked about 55% of patients are being rejected from hospitals in emergency rooms, and that's not only who have coronavirus. And there was a case of a 60-year-old man who was refused by the hospital, died at home, right? There's cases.
11-year-old kid hit by a car in a car accident, couldn't get into a hospital. I mean, lots of cases where the hospitals are overwhelmed because of the corona patients. So we're definitely getting into that zone now. But we've gotten to this point, for a long time without the testing. There is a suggestion, there's some articles in The Economist which suggested, Japan was kind of forced to take the strategy that it took, that it didn't have the resources to test. But there was a suggestion that, focusing only on the clusters, and only on the known cases, and not trying to boil the ocean, not trying to, figure out in the whole population who has it, arguably allowed Japan to use the limited resources that it had better to manage the pandemic, as opposed to just it became unmanageable in the UK so much faster. But at the same time, in New Zealand, in Korea, in Taiwan, they did test everybody. And they got rid of it. They got down to 0. So it can be done. I don't know if you could do that in a country of 127 million people, though, and especially like Japan, where everything is so decentralized and not very well managed. But I'll be really curious to see how it goes in Hiroshima. I'm glad to hear that and the testing has gotten so much better now too. Now I've heard that there are tests that they can get a result like within a couple of hours, and you only need to spit. You don't have to do that horrible thing up the nose. So, everything's always improving, I suppose.
It seemed like for a while there, the only way you could get a test is if you went to the airport. They were the only place that were testing in Japan, right?
Is that right?
But
well, actually, you could always pay for private tests, and those have become more widely available now. And they used to be expensive and hard to get. But if you want to test, again, it's changed dramatically since like June and July, where there was a lot of, particularly in English-speaking social media circles online, there was virtual panic about the inability to get tests and to navigate the system for catching and testing people. But I think
one thing that'll be
it's
interesting
available now
to
if you want
see. One. Yeah, I've seen advertising for companies, like private companies, where you can buy one for like 20,000 yen. So I guess if you are going abroad or coming back, you have to buy one, right? And then how is that data put into the numbers? Are they added to the numbers, or only official tests? Yeah.
But I understand now they do count private testing as well, but that wasn't the case for a long time.
It'll be interesting in Hiroshima to see how many people come forward, because it'll be voluntary. Because there is, of course, a stigma attached to getting a test or having a positive test, or, and Hiroshima people are no strangers to having stigma from even being from Hiroshima, and people not wanting to marry you or go to a school or a business, like even generations down now. So I'm glad they're doing it, and it'll be really interesting to see how it works out. Another kind of tangent of this is how slow the vaccines are in Japan. So I was reading up on that a little bit. Yeah. And I found that less than 30% of people in Japan consider vaccines safe. It seems like Japan, according to these articles I was reading, is a very kind of untrusting of vaccines more than other countries around the world, and they think this might be one of the reasons why it's so slow to be adopted in Japan. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so there's 3 parts there. There's generally why Japan is slow on approving vaccines, and then there's this case, which I don't think actually in this case, if anything, where everyone was scrambling in December, where they barely even did patient trials and they were just rushing it out, and Japan's just taking till February. I don't think you can say in this case that Japan's slow. I think Japan, if anything, is on a sane pace. But generally, yeah, it is slow. And the third issue that you mentioned as well on the fact that vaccination is generally voluntary, and there are a lot of people that just don't like to get them. So look, having had a kid 11 years ago and going through all of that, there was a thing back in the beginning of the pandemic that Japan does. Was it MMR? I don't think it was MMR, but it's one of there is a particular type of subsidized vaccinations available if you want to get them for your kids that are available, which aren't generally used in Western Europe and America. And one of the original theories on why it didn't spread so much here was this vaccination. I think it ended up only being a correlation. I don't think there's been a proven link to it. But on the one hand, I was
asking for that when our kids were getting vaccinated, because you had to get the MR
so local health board decides,
and the M, like you had to get it separate. You couldn't get it together. And I was like, what? Why don't we just do it together? And they're like, we don't do that in Japan. So I thought, okay, that's fine. But of course, all kids have to get vaccinated. It's not a choice to go to school.
I think even the kids' vaccinations, it's not pushed as hard. And I think there was an article in the Japan Times talking about this recently, which was going through how, the government's not as forceful, again, not as coercive about making it mandatory. I think at the same time, I think there's a general high degree of individual responsibility to go and get it done. And of course, local governments and health boards subsidize it heavily. It's practically free. So why wouldn't you do it? But given the absence of the sort of coercion, there's a lot of people, if you just casually think maybe vaccines aren't safe, there's nothing to really force you to change your mind on that in Japan. I think, again, it's liberalism in the sense of people being left to free to think and do what they like without much government intervention. And that's one consequence.
That number, because 30% who don't believe
that's a
vaccines,
high number.
That's a really high number. And
that's right. There was a case of
people
rubella
getting influenza vaccines every year, I thought. So I was really surprised by that. And NHK did a survey and they found 36% of people don't want to take the COVID vaccine. And I thought that sounds a bit high too.
Well, and apparently, I mean, globally there are high numbers of mistrust of the COVID vaccine as well. I mean, at the same time, in my boat, I never took the annual flu vaccines or anything like that, even when they were offered for free at work, as they usually are. But when I had a kid, and he's getting shots all the time, and I'm worried about getting sick from him or getting him sick, I started just doing it casually every year. I think it's partly just because it's made so in a way they make it easily available, but they don't twist your arm to do it, which maybe they should.
And they're expensive. The flu vaccines we get in our area, I stopped doing it every year because it's $5,000 per person, and it really adds up. If you've got a family of 4.
Yeah.
And I can see how cost-wise people wouldn't want to do it. So if you make it free, and you make it mandatory before kids go to school, which in our kids' case, that we had to show that they had their vaccines done. So I think, I was surprised. But one interesting other article I found is U.S. military in Japan are all being vaccinated for COVID right now. And I thought that was really interesting. Yeah. So there are residents of Japan now who are being vaccinated. It's just non-military are not. And they say Japan is 2 months later than the rest of the world in starting the vaccination. And normal people cannot expect to get a vaccine until 2022. So that is a little bit late.
I thought they were aiming for like July. I mean, basically, they seem to be aiming for the date of the Olympics to sort of get it done. They're certainly talking about getting elderly and medical workers done in March.
Medical workers first, elderly next, and think how many elderly are in Japan. So it's very unlikely
that's most of the country,
regular people who are not elderly or medical are going to get a vaccine till next year. But speaking of the Olympics.
Yes. Well,
shall we?
By the way, just before we go on to the Olympics, the other thing about why it takes so long generally, there's a thing where so many things in Japan where the government does a lot to protect local industries. This happens a lot in agriculture. It happens a lot in the medical devices and medical industry. Huge scandal in the 1990s where when they first had test machines that could test for HIV for on blood. And local machine makers, they didn't want to allow imports of these devices from the US. They wanted to be given 2 more years to create devices for Japan. And during that period, a whole bunch of hemophiliac people in Japan got HIV. And they sued the government for withholding permission to import to give a leg up to the local companies that were trying to catch up. That's one thing. On vaccinations and medicines in general, Japan actually has a bunch of great pharmaceutical companies, but I've been involved in M&A and so on of Japanese and foreign pharmaceutical companies. In Japan, they are way more conservative. They move way more slowly. There's an approach in the US to quickly commercialize medicines, to get them tested and out in the market as soon as possible, and you'll get fired if your product isn't successful. There's a lot more time taken, a lot more acceptance of failure in the Japan processes, which is kind of good from a safety perspective, but there's no urgency or rushing with it. It's partly cultural. But yeah, in this case, it's fascinating to see how it's a very different approach, but I don't mind waiting till February to make sure that it's safe.
Yeah, I read an article about that actually, that one of the news reports was saying they are sheltering small pharmaceutical companies from the competition, usually, when you have a vaccine or a drug come in. But that they're trying to speed up the COVID vaccine because it's an exceptional case.
Yes. Yeah, there's a few rare cases. I mean, they held up the contraceptive pill for 30 years, but when they had Viagra, they actually got a special bill in Parliament to approve its import on. It was the fastest approved drug in Japanese history, and it was imported.
What a surprise that a medicine for men got approved faster.
Yeah, that's shown a light on who's legislating.
Not very gender equal there, is it?
Absolutely not. Well, sometimes you've got to have a case so bad like that you can't do it anymore afterwards. And that was kind of, I mean, that's where the pill got approved right after that because it was so outrageous, the imbalance.
Yeah, it's important to make our voices heard when we see an imbalance and to speak out. And Baye has shown us how to do that. Thank you, Baye.
Amen.
So talking about, what was it? The Olympics, which was a tangent, of course, of the coronavirus
that's a really
problems.
Good idea.
It's not the best news in the world, but of course in Tokyo the officials are saying they're not going to back down. There is no discussion about delaying, but large percentage of the public is saying they would prefer it be delayed or rescheduled or even canceled still. And now there's discussion that the United Nations is going to have to decide whether
the United
Olympics,
Nations?
Yes.
I haven't heard that.
Yeah, that was in one of the news reports I found.
Well, the thing is, it wasn't popular in the first place, even in Tokyo, to even bid for the Olympic Games. They're always a huge sort of a burden, and the fact that it was kind of seen as the former governor of Tokyo's kind of vanity project to bring back 1964. He was very nostalgic for 1964, and he wanted to bring that back, which was that had a huge impact on Japan when that was done. That it was frankly a vanity project, and he failed the first time. And then just when he was preparing the second bid, we had the Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami. And again, then when we won it, all of the reconstruction money that was being sent up to Tohoku got redirected to Tokyo for all the construction projects for the Olympics. So it actually, and this is what everyone was saying, we should be spending the money up there, not down here. And spending it here took away all the resources from the Northeast. And everyone in Tokyo was saying, please don't bring it here. And then on top of that, you have this. And I think a really kind of scary example of exactly what all of this means is happening right now with the Australian Open tennis, where just a much smaller number of athletes and coaches and so on coming in, and they're trying to do it in a bubble and having them travel around, and they're already finding that some of the athletes are bringing in cases, and the result is they've had to quarantine all of the athletes. And everyone's angry, and it's I don't know how, even if they stop it in Japan.
You can't really say that Japan has it under control, right? With all of the rising cases and everything, and then
absolutely not.
Right?
And then to bring in tens of thousands of athletes from every country in the world, which almost certainly also don't have it under control. I mean, how does anyone see this as a good idea? It seems I love the Olympics in the normal one.
In terms of sustainability, The Olympics could be a good thing in a normal year because it could bring in more visitors, not just for the Olympic Games, but they could stay longer. They could do more rural tourism. It could really open their eyes to the beauty of Japan, and they could return as visitors. They could return as working residents. In theory, the Olympics could be a great tool for kind of destination branding, right? But
Absolutely.
in this pandemic, it just does not seem like a
Well,
good idea to be pushing forward.
I mean, look, this Olympics itself, part of the reason the bid won was it bid on its sort of ecological friendliness in the sense that they were reusing the venues from the '64 Olympics, although they didn't really need to knock down a perfectly good stadium and rebuild it when they could have just used the existing one. It was still can still hold 100,000 people. But the fact that they rebuilt the new stadium completely out of wood, it's one of the biggest wood structures in Japan, and yeah, through all the marketing and the ambitions for how they were going to run this, they really emphasized actual resource consumption and efficiency and renewal. That was sort of infused in everything. The thing is, no one's really paying much attention to what they made the stadium out of right now. So the opportunity's lost. You're right. In the normal run of things, it would actually be an excellent opportunity. There was a big focus on sustainability as a theme, and Japan sort of showing off how great they are at it for the Olympics. But at the moment, I don't. Yeah, unfortunately, that's just completely lost because there are
Which is
unfortunately
kind of
bigger
a
things.
shame that they haven't continued with some of the green targets that they had for the Olympics, like hydrogen energy, hydrogen buses. It was
Have they
supposed to
stopped with
be.
those?
There is no going forward. There is no hydrogen refueling station. They were supposed to
There,
have. They
they
have
are in
one.
Tokyo. I mean, they could do it.
There
I don't
is
know if they're. I didn't
one.
know they're actually going to do that. Yeah, there's
Yeah,
one.
there's one, and there was supposed to be by now, because the Olympics is only a few months away, there was supposed to be 8, 10. All the power was supposed to be made by renewable energy, green hydrogen, and brought down to Tokyo. There were all these great plans in terms of sustainability, and
Mm.
I haven't heard that going forward, but if they are planning to go ahead with the Olympics, definitely
Mm.
we should be hearing about these great
Well,
infrastructure changes for green power and everything, right?
I don't know that they're not doing it. I just think that right now all the media attention is obviously focused on the bigger elephant in the
Yeah,
room.
yeah.
Look, every
COVID.
day now I open up Nikkei and there's some new story about. I mean, the Japanese government has put so much weight and investment into the switch to replacing uh, gasoline and petroleum-based energy infrastructure to converting it over to hydrogen and then setting up the supply. Most of it's blue right now. They're still trying to figure out green, but every day you're reading stuff about that, so it's still perfectly possible to me that they could have a bus on a loop. I mean, I think they could all probably go from the stadium to the gas station and back. So they could probably do all this. I haven't heard that they're not doing it, and that was what they were marketing the games are going to be for. But like I said, it's just a shame that it's going to be lost in the noise. I think if they try to do it this way, I mean, hopefully we'll see. I'm always an optimist. I haven't heard that they're not doing these things, and I don't see why they would have to stop them. So who knows?
Well, on a positive note, which is kind of related to that, you had the article about Japan had the lowest greenhouse gases emissions on record in
Yeah,
fiscal 2019. So
a,
that's
a
impressive.
lot of good things, and that so pre-pandemic to emphasize as well, and being done with almost no nuclear power. In fact, I'm kind of perplexed a little bit as to what the if you scroll down the page, there's a graph showing the energy source breakdown, and nuclear is still quite big there, which I thought all the nuclear power plants were shut down. So I don't quite understand that they've also they've got a single pointy thing going to the green bit for renewable energy. But it is encouraging to see, as you can see there, that renewable energy has clearly grown a lot. Um, you can see the trend, which everyone knows happened with 2011 and the Great East Japan earthquake. The nuclear component disappeared, and that was replaced effectively by fossils, by natural gas, oil, coal. But that is now coming down, and yeah, the amount of renewables is growing. So it's going in a good direction. It's good to see, and I assume it's going to collapse in 2020 just because of the drop in economic output. But in 2019, yeah, Japan is on a quietly on a good curve. So that's really encouraging to see.
We still need outside people who are watching and making sure that it is renewable energy, because there was a scandal even happening now with HAS trying to start a new energy power plant running on palm oil imported from Indonesia, which is not renewable at all, but it was under the renewable part of the graph. So we need to have international watchdogs. Biomass.
Biomass is an interesting one, isn't it? I'm not. Yes, theoretically you can log a forest and then burn it, and you're just if you grow the trees back, it's okay. And palm oil, they're obviously controversial, but they do grow quickly. But you're also putting all of that into the air.
They're cutting down old growth, and there's a lot of problems. Plus, you're relying again on imports, right? So when you have imports, you have the whole forestry and harvesting and growing and then shipping. You've got to add all of that as part of your emissions. Whereas if you do solar or wind, once you make it in Japan, you're generating it in Japan. You don't need to import anything new. It just seems
well, and all of that oil, natural gas, coal, everything is imported into Japan. Japan has never been able to produce enough energy or resources for itself before. So this is another reason why the Japanese government is plugging away. It just doesn't have the infrastructure right now. It's another reason why green hydrogen is a great opportunity for Japan, because you can make it anywhere, and you can make it regardless of whether energy is being consumed. You can actually do it while people are not using electricity. So there's a huge opportunity. There's a bunch of reasons why that makes a lot of sense strategically for Japan to invest in, and that's why they're doubling down on it. But it's still early days.
Yeah, I love your article about Japan's NTT betting on battery storage and the green transformation. It's wonderful.
Yeah, that really surprised me. I didn't know much about it. Obviously, NTT is the Bell AT&T of Japan. It's the former monopoly phone company, and apparently they consume 1% of all the electricity in Japan, basically powering just about all of Japan's wired. It's landline telephone infrastructure, and they're the biggest mobile infrastructure as well. So they've actually the Iwate prefecture so hit hard by the tsunami and so on, and they were cut off for a long time, and they had no electricity for a long period of time after the Great East Japan earthquake. So they realized the importance of local generation, and NTT's paying for it. They're putting in they're going to have them 30%, and on a pretty long timeline, they want to get to 100% on batteries and solar. So good from them. And interesting as well, that's the Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communications. Everyone associates energy really with METI, but this is the phone regulator is also putting a lot of money into subsidizing this kind of thing. So it's good to see. I think as Japan does, they're quietly across the board plugging away. There's another article I shared about how all the buildings in Marunouchi, in the main business district in Tokyo, including buildings I used to work in, they're all making sure now they're switching to paying for 100% sustainable certified electricity, renewable electricity. And these are significant buildings, and they're doing it because they want to attract tenants that demand that. It's not spectacular, but it's what I love about Japan is that, there's not so many publicity stunts, but there's a lot of really good things going on when you take a look.
That's really good. And it's so important that these changes are happening, and you say they're doing it kind of quietly, but these make really big difference. One of my 5 targets this year, in a post at the beginning of the year, I always do, what would I do if I had the power to make 5 changes in Japan in terms of going forward with sustainability, and definitely putting solar or some kind of renewable energy on the roof of buildings for businesses and residences where people use it, having battery storage so they could use it at night. This just makes so much sense because you're making power where you're using it. You don't have to rely on the grid, which we've talked about before has so many problems, right? So
and this is also the appeal of hydrogen. This is the other thing with that as well. I mean, it's a substitute for battery. You've got 3 options with renewable, with excess generation. You've got pumped hydro, which again requires making big dams, but that's a good solution, and it's very efficient and it's used everywhere, but it involves flooding lots of things. You've got batteries, which are popular right now, and they can work with anything that currently exists, and like your car. And they're good, but batteries are messy to make and messy to dispose of. And hydrogen has drawbacks, but you can make it locally. You could have petrol stations which are actually creating, you could actually have solar panels on the roof using electrolysis on nearby water, which could be the ocean or rivers or anything, and converting water into the fuel that's sold it locally. You don't have to even transport it. The government, I think, is focusing on switching petroleum infrastructure, having ships and trucks and gas tanks, just like with petrol. But the real appeal of green hydrogen is the idea that you don't have to transport it. You can actually use it to store, excess locally. And it's, again, you've got to set up the storage infrastructure for it. But once you have it, it actually has advantages which exceed even batteries. And, it's a huge conversion to do that. But the idea that you could have basically unlimited clean electricity available, and not be, even during earthquakes and stuff like this, not be dependent on a grid for it. Yeah, I think it's... and it makes all the wind and all the solar worthwhile. So, yeah,
Hi, Baye.
I'm really glad to see we're
Baye
investing.
has just joined. Thanks for joining,
Oh,
Baye. We
hey,
were
Baye.
just praising you and your wonderful article in the Japan Times today. He says, "Hey, Hiko."
Hey, Baye. He must have been sneezing. You know how in Japan that people say that whenever people talk about you, that's what makes you sneeze. So he
Is
must have
that
had a
right?
sneezing fit
Not
earlier.
not your ears burning. Is that different?
Well, it's the same thing, yeah.
Yeah. One of the things that I always come up against for hydrogen, though, is if you're going to use all of that energy to make hydrogen from renewable energy, why don't you
Yeah.
just use the renewable energy and put it directly into the cars? Or
Ah,
use the renewable energy and put it into batteries at people's homes, or even into the grid. Like, why use all that energy to create another thing which then you use?
oh, I don't think it's one or the other. I think there's cases where it makes more sense for batteries and cases where it makes more sense for hydrogen. But the point about hydrogen is it's another method like a battery for storing it. But the advantage being, for example, if you want trucks or airplanes or stuff like that, you can't power airplanes with batteries. You can't power, huge ships or whatever with it. You can transport it around to where it's needed. So it's got the advantages. It's got power density, and it's got the flexibility that you actually have with petroleum-based energy, but it's clean. So you don't need that in every case. And batteries make sense in a lot of cases. But I would love to see batteries and these sort of tanks everywhere. And the point is, then you're not letting anything go to waste that way.
And the hydrogen, you mentioned ships and airplanes. Hydrogen has that
Yeah,
superpower long charge capacity, which batteries don't have right now. So there is a
yeah. You
lot of
can fill up a
potential.
car and drive
A lot of
in
potential.
5 minutes and drive 500 miles on it. And with the power of a Tesla. And the cars are lighter because they don't have enormous batteries.
But
But there
the
aren't many examples of
technology is
that yet.
not quite there right now, and we
No.
have renewable energy, we have batteries.
Uh,
So I like to go with what we actually have
uh,
right now. Let's do more of
yeah,
that.
absolutely.
And
By the way, the other thing
keep
is I'm a
product
space geek. So
development for the others. Yeah, for sure.
I'm a space geek. So the idea that wherever you can find ice, you can convert that not only into drinking water so you can live on the moon or on Mars, but you could also power rockets with it. You can actually light it. You don't have to put it through a fuel cell. And it actually works as rocket fuel. And it's clean. I don't think it's the thing, but I think for a government investing on an infrastructure basis, it's a good thing. Batteries are there, and those are going to be the thing for a while. But I do think what is exciting for me as a sort of a Japan watcher is America is unquestionably leading the world right now on batteries, but they're using batteries because they don't have a choice. There's no other sort of big infrastructure thing being undertaken right now. Japan, if they do this right, they could leapfrog. Japan could become the example to the world. And remember as
Well,
well, those Teslas are powered on Panasonic
Is a
batteries.
world leader. Yeah. Panasonic is doing a lot of work with Tesla.
Yeah,
They have the
they make the
technology.
batteries.
They do.
So,
They do.
it's I think it's cool. I
Yeah.
think we're going to be sitting here. It'll be I'm optimistic that Japan energy-wise is going to be like the mobile phones, in 2005 before the iPhone. It'll be like everyone's going to be looking here and say, "How did you guys suddenly get so far ahead? What did you guys do?" Yeah. I'm optimistic that's what it's going to be like.
Yeah, interesting. One of the points that you made last night, which was kind of a funny news about Sapporo's label, but it
Oh,
sparked something in my mind about consumer behavior in Japan and how the acceptance of ugly food and how that leads to food waste. I thought that was an
oh.
interesting tangent. Anyway, introduce the label, the Sapporo labels. I thought that was fun.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so a spelling miss I mean, honestly, could you imagine if there was a spelling miss in Japanese on a label in an American beer? Would they toss out all the beer? So, but and it's funny. I mean, I think everybody, the entire world, Japan and outside, said, "Don't throw away the beer." You could look at that from a sustainability and environmental friendliness perspective, but most people just wanted to drink the beer, I think, and were hoping it would be
Yeah.
cheaper with the spelling mistake. Uh,
But that comes back to something that I often come across is that students of mine who work in a bakery in America, when I worked in a bakery, once it gets a little bit old, it's discounted or it's given to the staff. And they were
yeah.
told they had to throw it in the bin. There were these rules in Japan that you were not allowed to sell it cheap. You were not allowed to
Wow.
give it to people, right?
Yeah.
There's also a big problem with farmers will say if their vegetable or fruit doesn't look perfect, the supermarket won't take it.
Well,
So
actually,
it
you
leads
know
to a
what?
lot of food waste.
So I'm sure you have this in Hiroshima. Before the 7 o'clock national news on NHK, they have the local news, and I always find it astounding that Tokyo has local news, which encompasses Chiba, Saitama, Kanagawa, and Tokyo. So 35 million people, nearly double the population of Australia, and they have a local news show. And the thing is, it feels like local news. They have the local agricultural fair and all the vegetables or some children's bento thing. They actually do a local news sort of feel to it, even though I'm thinking this is actually like one of the biggest countries in the world sort of area. But there's been a lot of coverage on this about how with all of the companies closed down and all the cafeterias and so on, all of the suppliers that were just sole suppliers of these cafeterias have been growing all of this food and they're trying to give it away. They're giving it away by the roadside where they are, but where they produce it up in Chiba in the mountains, I'm sure there's similar things down there. Um, yeah, it is really frustrating to see the amount of food waste that's kind of been caused because a lot of these farmers don't have the supply networks to get their stuff into supermarkets or into people who need the food, to food support and stuff like that. And there's a lot of food going to waste right now. And it's very frustrating to watch. On top
It
of
is.
course, the
I
agricultural policies that encourage
I
people to
always
toss
keep
food away.
keep a lookout in Japan for the honesty boxes. Do you ever
Mm,
see the honesty boxes around the rural areas? Even in my neighborhood, sometimes I can find it. So a local farmer who's growing a bit of food, they'll just leave it in a little like stand, and there'll
mm,
be a box, and it'll say how much they want you to put in, and just on your honor, you put the coins in and you take what you've paid for. And I love that about Japan. And
mm.
I often see it in rural areas. And so if farmers even put their produce, even if it was ugly, I think people would buy it in the
Yeah.
local area because
Oh,
local has a good connotation,
well,
right, for consumers.
I've seen that in Nerima, which is one of the 23 wards of Tokyo, but it gets starting to get a bit rural. Actual in a vending machine, actual in a machine where you've got the things and you can see them, but you still is an honest. It's like an honesty vending machine, which
Nice.
yeah,
Oh,
it works.
wow.
But of course, as anyone who eats vegetables knows, often the reason foods look good in the supermarket is that they're sprayed so full of water to keep themselves looking fresh. And it's actually kind of a sign when they look a bit dried and scrunched up. That's often just a sign that they're not like that. They taste better. Um, I'm sure people who buy stuff locally, even especially in Japan, appreciate that. But it still is amazing how good looking the food here is. Like how just through force of will, how Japanese farmers are able to produce the sort of food that they produce.
Yeah.
And we're very lucky for it. But yeah, yeah, but yeah, but all the more reason why. So in New Zealand, all the good apples get sent to Japan, and the medium ones get sent to Europe, and the crappy ones stay back in New Zealand. And it's always a bit of a roll of the dice for apples in New Zealand. But here, when you see people on TV, when you see farmers throwing away apples and food, and it looks like the very best stuff that I'd see back in New Zealand, it's crazy to me.
Yeah.
I wish
Or
there's something we
even
could do about that.
Or even I was talking to Farmer Thomas the other day in Wakayama in Hiroshima, and he was
Yeah.
talking about how because of the aging population, you have a lot of people with fruit trees,
Mm,
but they're too old to go and harvest it. Or
right.
the place is abandoned, but there's all these beautiful fruit trees. So he's trying to coordinate, and I think people are doing this all over Japan and hopefully do it more, is to volunteer to go
Oh,
in and pick the fruit, and of course give whoever is the owner some if they're around, but to make use of that instead of just letting it rot, at least it
uh,
composts when it drops, but
you just
it'd be
reminded me. We had
nice.
friends in New Zealand. It's funny in New Zealand. Sometimes you'll have a friend's house that has a huge old tree with fruit, and it's actually, it's a blessing and a curse at the same time when those things, you can't consume it all. I had friends that had a huge grapefruit tree, so it was like raining rotten grapefruits from this tree. So they had to try to pick as many, and they were just trying to juice dozens of liters just to be able to use it all. And I remember we'd get huge rubbish bags full of grapefruits, and we were just trying to juice it all. But that was great. I missed that. So
Yeah.
that sounds like
I
a
mean, that's a
great
good
problem.
point too, right? Like if the fruit doesn't look great, you could probably still make great juice from it.
Yeah,
Or if the
yeah,
apple is a bit damaged, you could probably make applesauce. Like utilize it in some way, right? I was talking to a ume expert in Wakayama the other day, and
yeah.
he's talking about how the farmers put nets under the trees, and because
Mm,
it's on a hill, they put
yeah,
all the nets together, and then naturally when the ume drops, they all just roll down the hill to their buckets, so they don't actually have to go up in the mountains and harvest. And I thought, what
smart.
a great simple solution. Yeah,
Yeah.
we need more innovation like that. I
I'll take
like
all the
that.
umeshu and ume that they can make. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. It sounds like quite a long process, and I showed him mine that I still had the fruit in, and he's like, "You need to take the fruit out." So it was very useful for me to have a ume expert
Yeah.
on the series. I didn't know you had
Well,
to take the fruit out after a certain point. So yeah, that was
yeah,
interesting.
because they always sell it with the fruit in the bottle, so I just assumed it was in there the whole time. Well, there you
That's
go. I
right.
just learned something myself.
But if you're keeping it for a long time, you should take the fruit out. Yeah, apparently.
I
Yeah,
see.
very smart. So we've got about 8 more minutes.
Yep.
What should we do next? Toyota's fine was interesting to me.
Yeah.
Toyota, that you were talking about, they had $180 million fine for
From the EPA.
non-compliance with the EPA. And that was interesting because Toyota is famous for kind of going above and beyond for
Yeah.
compliance, right?
Yeah, it was really surprising that, I mean, I still have not gotten over I mean, and it's one of the German diesel scandal, Dieselgate, is so outrageous. In retrospect, it's like, well, of course, how could we have ever thought that diesel cars were cleaner than normal cars? How could anyone have thought something so ridiculous? But everyone believed,
Clean
oh, it's
diesel.
because
Who
they're
believe? We
German.
all believed it. Yeah, clean
Yeah,
diesel.
well, we all sort of just told ourselves Germans are just such great engineers. They found a way to make diesel clean, which obviously they didn't do. In fact, they put deceptive defeat devices on the cars, and I still haven't gotten over the shock of that. And they really deserve all the punishments. Actually, the head of Volkswagen, I think, went on a vacation to Greece, which has an extradition treaty with the US, and he got deported to the
Oh,
US a week ago.
wow.
So this is the thing: Germany doesn't deport its citizens to any other country, or extradite its citizens to any other country. But yeah, when this person took a vacation to, in fact, it was Croatia. It wasn't Greece. It was Croatia. They went to Croatia, and Croatia picked up the identity, realized he was on an EPA criminal watch list from the US, and they flew him over to the US for prison. So yeah, the US is taking this totally seriously. With Toyota, nothing quite as malicious as that, but at the same time, yeah,
Sounds
it's
like it was a
surprising.
misunderstanding, is what they're saying, that they were
They're following
compliant
the
with
California standards.
California, and California they expected to be the highest in compliance, but yeah, it's
And that's
it's
the other,
it's
yeah,
surprising because when they had an airbag problem in the Prius years ago, they recalled all the cars, and other car companies had the same problem and decided not to do a total recall.
yeah.
So I was
Yeah,
surprised to
they're
read
always
that.
forthright with that sort of thing, and that's what killed Mitsubishi was, not doing recalls well and stuff like that. And Toyota's good at that, so I don't read it as being deceptive. I genuinely believe. I mean, my impression is as well. I always thought that California had the highest standard. I remember reading all of these stories about California being in conflict with the national government in the US over putting in higher standards, and the auto industry opposing it and trying to pressure California not to. So I kind of would have
Yeah.
made the same casual assumptions myself. But there again, if you're actually selling cars in the US, you'd assume that check. Um, the other thing as well, I mean, it's good to see in a way that there's this sort of enforcement. it's a little bit surprising given the current administration and who's been running the EPA for the last, I think,
Yeah,
Coal Baron
no
has been running the EPA.
Yeah. I mean, they
Which will,
stopped doing air pollution data, which they used to. They stopped doing
yeah.
a lot of the watchdog things that they were doing in the
And
last 4 years. So I'm surprised by this. But
I'm not
it
questioning
shows
that Toyota violated.
it
Sorry.
shows you how important watchdogs are. That
Absolutely.
to have third parties keeping an eye on companies is a good thing.
I do wonder a little bit. I don't question that they wouldn't be prosecuting if Toyota wasn't on the hook for this. And Toyota's always good at accepting when it screws up like this, as that I'm sure they will. But at the same time, the fact that a big Japanese car company was the target of this, there's probably something else there that, okay, they're going to allow enforcement in this case because it's kind of a political win-win. But I'm certainly going to be interested to see what I hope will be an increase in general enforcement with the changing of the administration. The other thing I hope is that, on the one hand, while I see this as a return to normalcy coming to America this week, I mean, I hope it's a little bit scary what's been going on over there. But what I really also hope is that we don't end up with radical swings every time there's an election. Like, enforcement of environmental criteria, it shouldn't be political. It should be absolute common sense from any perspective. And I think that's how it's been until now, that it's good to have clean air and it's good to have water and it's good to have enforcement and tracking. And
Yes.
there hasn't been like a left-right thing until now. Whereas now I worry, on the one hand, I want to see that come back, but I don't want that to become something that's going to get completely tossed out every 4 years either, for the US's sake. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see.
We can't afford it in terms of the environment, in terms of our communities and the wealth gap. And so many things that did not get addressed for 4 years.
Well, the Flint
We
thing.
really, but we
Fascinating
don't
that
want to talk about America. We could spend the
That's right, we
whole,
will.
the whole
could,
time. But
won't
one
do
more
that.
interesting thing about Japan and Toyota,
Yes.
Suga, Prime Minister Suga made the announcement that 2030 is the last time a full gas car can be sold. And he got some pushback from Toyota. So there's another thing where Toyota said that's too soon, but in terms of the international standards and the movements going forward for 2050, it sounds like something that really it's not a unreasonable target.
He said 2035, and then Tokyo one-upped them because Governor Koike, the governor of Tokyo, former environment minister, and she said in Tokyo, we're going to make it 2030. And then Toyota called a press conference and said, everybody stop. This is too fast.
I think they said 2035 for hybrids, but 2030 was all 100% gas cars was going to be phased out. So 2030 is the last year you can sell an old gas car. I don't know why anyone would buy it then, but you can actually sell one then. But from then, you're not allowed to sell them. So in terms of the way automobile businesses run, this is fast, right? They don't plan to change that quickly.
Yeah, well, there's two things. One, in Japan, you do have an accelerated car ownership cycle because it's actually manufactured by the government that it becomes basically uneconomic to own a car for more than 7 years. They increase the cost of registration every year, that when a car gets to be 7 years old, it's so expensive to renew that you're better off selling the car and getting a new one. And that's on purpose. That's to help support people buying new cars every 7 years. It's also why all the used imports.
That didn't happen for me.
Sorry?
Does that happen for people? Because that didn't happen for me. For what, the yearly fee for like road tax?
Based on the age of the car, the cost of the shaken goes up. And it hits a threshold at about the 7 or 8 year mark where you can buy a 7 or 8 year old car for like $5,000, but you'll have to pay about that much in registration fees or something. It'll work out that it just and once it hits that point, it's hard to sell in Japan because of the registration fees. That's when they export them overseas, and that's why all the newest cars in New Zealand are 7-year-old Japanese cars, which are in great condition.
But in my case, we had a car for more than 10 years twice.
Okay.
I've been here so long, and it didn't really increase in fees, and we were able to get rid of it secondhand I mean, you don't get much for a secondhand car, to be honest. Right. It's a buyer's market. It's not a great seller's market for secondhand cars.
Well, that's why the depreciation is so intense, though, as well, is that the government tries to stack the field to incentivize people to buy new cars and to renew their cars, and not hold on to them for 30 or 40 years.
That's why you should buy a Tesla, because the
Yeah.
resale rate is quite good.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But coming back on why Toyota's kind of in trouble with the schedule, it's half is the cycle is that, they sort of have this time with the cars that they're making that they, to switch over, they need that sort of buffer period. But the other thing is that, I've been having a discussion on Twitter, you may have seen, where Nikkei put out an article one day saying this is going to be a crisis for the supply chain networks. All the small factories and artisans and so on, the thousands of companies that just build parts of combustion engines and supply almost exclusively to certain car manufacturers. When Nissan cleaned up their supply chain network, it ruined hundreds of companies. And there was a lot of pushback, even though it saved Nissan. It's what Gong got credit for. A lot of people at Nissan hated it because they hated ruining the businesses of a lot of their suppliers that they were really attached to. And Toyota's in the same position. Half of Aichi Prefecture around Nagoya is connected to the supply chain of Toyota,
Definitely.
making parts that are redundant in EVs.
Yeah.
On the other hand, at CES, and it's funny, a few days later, Nikkei put another article saying a huge opportunity for Japanese companies. Panasonic making the batteries. Sony at CES released a video of an electric car that they made. So now you've got like the Apple's trying to contract to get a car made. Sony, all the mobile phone makers are now preparing to make EVs. And apparently EVs are in many ways, the components are just scaled up versions of what's in phones. So, Japan's got an advantage over here, but it's hugely disruptive, right? And that's something which Toyota is probably screaming that, that disruption when they're so entrenched in a really big complex. And, half the prefecture of Aichi it relies upon, and to say that's going to be gone in 10 years, it's not as easy as just saying make batteries.
It's the same in Hiroshima. There's so many connected industries with Mazda, right? And it's the same in many other parts of Japan. So that's definitely something to consider. But hopefully when the government makes targets and then the side businesses and the main businesses can think about what is possible, not just about getting rid of your stock, but what is possible and what is necessary in terms of meeting the targets, because it's better for everybody if we can cut emissions, that's for sure.
This is where Tesla's, I know we're over time as well, but this is where Tesla was so smart, because Musk has been open. I mean, their advantage is they don't have any suppliers. They make everything internally themselves, and they have very few components. But they've also said for car companies that are struggling with this, they'll sell the skateboards to other cars and they can put their bodies and stuff on top. So just by being first and having that scale, their opportunity, not just for selling their own cars, but for selling the Mazdas 10 years from now to help them make their targets as well. So smart. I mean, it was such a big risk to go and invest that much, but I think it's a fantastic that they've got it running for their business.
Yeah. It might have paid off. He's the richest man in the world now, right?
It seems to have worked out. Yeah.
I guess so. It's crazy. Well,
there's money in sustainability.
There is money in sustainability. Don't think only the cost. It's an investment, long-term investment, right? Thank you so much, Hiko. That was a great discussion. Thank you, everybody, for joining. And tomorrow morning, we are talking to Alfie Goodrich, the photographer, and taking a virtual journey with his beautiful photos. So please join us then. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great day. Bye.